When I was a pastor, I had a hard time from day to day knowing what I should prioritize. I would get to the office and I would think, boy, I could be working on worship. I could be trying to improve our song selection, the quality of our songs, the depth of what we were doing. I could work on discipleship. I could try to improve small groups, offer some better adult education courses, that kind of thing. Maybe fellowship was another thing I could work on. Creating some new picnics, social gatherings, try to work on greeting people, maybe service to the poor. We could try to be more effective in how we reach out to homeless people who come and ring our door at the church. We could also do evangelism. Shouldn't we have an evangelism day or weekend where people bring their friends? Maybe we should train people in evangelism more thoroughly. And this is a common issue, and I want us to think about that a bit today. And I'm going to suggest something that perhaps is a bit controversial, and you don't have to accept this completely, but I'm going to give you my pitch today. And that is, what is the purpose of the church? I was influenced by a book from 1995, Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Church, where he gave those 5 dimensions of what a church should be: fellowship, discipleship, worship, ministry, and evangelism. And I think Rick Warren was quite right to say that our budgets, how we spend our time, maybe we should have them balanced across those 5 purposes. Maybe we should use those 5 purposes as some sort of a grid to evaluate what we're doing. But I think that's really right. But I don't know that those 5 are really the right ways of describing the purposes of the church. So instead, there are a whole variety of ways of thinking about the church. So Scott Sundquist said that there are 2 purposes of the church. He's a Fuller Seminary professor. In his book, Understanding Christian Mission, he says worship and witness are the 2 ways of thinking about the church. And all other functions point to and should aid in fulfilling these 2 purposes. Tim Keller has said that there are 4 ministry fronts in his book, Center Church: connecting people to God, which he has included in that evangelism and worship; connecting people to one another through community and discipleship; number 3, connecting people to the city through mercy and justice; and connecting people to the culture through the integration of faith and work. So that's a 4-pronged way of thinking about it. I want to argue that the primary purpose of the church is an outward-facing mission to be a witness to Jesus Christ. And I want to get at that from primarily Acts 1:8. The call from Jesus, as described in the book of Acts: you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And that is the thesis statement of the book of Acts, and I think it's something that we should embrace as well. It picks up on the outward facing emphasis of the call to Abraham in Genesis 12, where God says to Abram, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The emphasis is on God calling Abraham so that his people, he and his people, would be a blessing to the world. And I think that needs to be of primary importance when we think about the purpose of the church, and that these other purposes actually fit under that primary purpose. Karl Barth says it this way: what is the task of the church? He says, to use the simplest and biblical formulation, you will be my witnesses. That is the task of the church. And there is something of an ecumenical consensus on this. Even the Roman Catholic Church would say that the church has a missionary nature. Not only that, but also the sociology, the research in terms of survey and polls and that sort of thing has shown that focus on outsiders is really a key ingredient, or the key ingredient to church health and to church growth. So for example, Kirk Hathaway in his Facts on Growth 2010, he says that we've found that there is a strong relationship between recruitment and evangelism and growth. The more time that a leader spends in this area, the more likely is a congregation to experience growth. The most frequently selected response in all denominational families, including conservative evangelical congregations, is that their leader only spends some time doing evangelism or recruitment, which may help explain why so many congregations are not growing. And they go on to say, this activity is least prevalent among non-Christian congregations, Roman Catholic and Orthodox congregations, and mainline congregations in that order. Conservative evangelical groups and other Christian groups are much more likely to say their leader spends quite a bit of time or a great deal of time doing recruitment or evangelism. A congregation cannot presume that new people will somehow find their way to a congregation and eventually join. Recruitment efforts are essential for growth, and the leader of the congregation must be involved. Some leaders avoid such activities, but more often than not, their congregations are declining. Also, similar along those lines, they've also shown evangelism and vision by the pastor tend to lead toward growth, but not other activities. So pastors putting their time into evangelism and mission. Now, again, we are not going for growth. Growth is more of a result. It's not a goal. But I do think that a noble goal is to obey that command from Jesus, that promise from Jesus that they will be my witnesses. Again, we see from people like Miroslav Volf, he says that the book of 1 Peter gets at this, that Christians have a mission in the world. They should conduct themselves, and this is 1 Peter 2:12, honorably among the Gentiles so that they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. Wolf says, indeed, the purpose of Christian existence as a whole is to proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. 1 Peter 2:9. There is a presupposition of mission. And somebody like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor and professor, said that the Christian community thus lives its own life in the midst of the world, continually bearing witness in all it is and does. That's from Discipleship. He says in Ethics, the space of the church is to testify to the world. And he says in Letters and Papers from Prison, the church is church only when it is there for others. There is an emphasis on that external orientation. A missional church really is redundant. A church should be missionary in its very nature, as the Roman Catholic Vatican II puts it. Local churches cannot just take mission trips, have a missions budget, have a missions committee. There be just these occasional evangelism type approaches. There needs to be this focus outside. Now, the objection to that is that Christians need to get their own house in order. Why should they be thinking about outsiders when they themselves have corruption, hypocrisy, inconsistency in their own churches? Shouldn't churches basically focus on being followers of Jesus in a vigorous, rigorous way, and then be agnostic, really, about whether others notice? And that is an approach that is very commonly emphasized. You see that in Mennonite, some Mennonite thinkers who emphasize that we are to be in the world, but we are not to be trying to engage in persuasion. We are not to try to be of influence. That when we try to be of influence, then power corrupts, and then we stop looking like Jesus. So there is a legitimate question there, but I think better to see that formation, discipleship, depth approach that I think we need to also pursue is really so that we might be salt and light in the world. It's a problem when we just emphasize Bible studies, depth. We need sermons with more meat, Pastor. We need, more worship services. We need more spiritual disciplines, when it's not done out of love and orientation for a hurting world. And under this heading, I would say that mission both incorporates both verbal witness and also social justice type approaches. Now, Leslie Newbegin has really helped me with this because he said that when missionaries have gone across the world and have tried to focus on just verbal proclamation, they vowed to themselves, I'm going to this new place, and I am not going to get sidetracked by education, by hospital work, by agriculture, by feeding people, by clean water, by justice issues. I am just going to go to plant churches and preach the good news to people. And Leslie Newbegin has a great line in his book, Open Secrets. He says, the gospel was too much for them. He says that though they tried not to do all these things, when there was a hungry, hurting person there, when there was water that was not clean, and yet the Western missionary, let's say, knew how to help with clean water. There was somebody dying of disease, and the Western missionary knew. The gospel was too great for them. They ended up lending aid. And it is an expression of the good news, to be good news, to be what Jesus was, a person of healing in the midst of a broken world. And so that is definitely often appropriate. We think about that if you are somebody who is in urban context with real serious social issues, or also in a rural context where there is issues of addiction and declining population and real serious social issues, where it's entirely appropriate for the church to be a light and to be brainstorming both short-term solutions to alleviate suffering and pain, and also to brainstorm intellectually and systematically about long-term solutions. But I like also what Leslie Newbegin says. He said that the Apostle Paul was going to a more advanced civilization than his own in the Roman Empire. And so he was not as caught up in the social problems, but rather there were the spiritual and emotional issues that needed to be dealt with in his context. And I think of that as well in the places where you see thriving evangelism programs. So, for example, on college campuses, where it's not so much, poverty is not the main issue there. Or I think about in London, a richer part of London, where Holy Trinity Brompton has started the Alpha program. The problem is a lack of meaning. Or I think about in Manhattan, where Tim Keller's church, Redeemer, did evangelism very effectively, or other places like that, where we actually see where people have their immediate physical needs met. There is depression. There is these issues of spiritual emptiness become clear, that people have these deep needs. And so there we are giving we are meeting the spiritual and emotional needs of people with the good news that Jesus Christ can bring forgiveness, He can bring reconciliation, He can give direction to how to live one's life. So why, though, do churches not do this? Why do churches focus on, like having worship services and that's it? Well, one reason is that we have the heritage of the Reformation, and the Protestant church has had a definition of the church, and it's rooted in the Augsburg Confession, Article 7. And what it says there is it says that the church is located where the gospel is rightly preached and the administration of the sacraments are rightly practiced. And for that reason, those have become the two things that pastors think of themselves needing to do. They are to preach rightly, and they are to administer the sacraments rightly. And if they've done that, then they've done their pastoral duty. They have a good church. The problem with that definition of the church is that, for one thing, rightly, that adverb, you can drive a truck through that so that people can spend a lifetime trying to figure out exactly what is right to preach and how to rightly administer the sacraments. There's no end to that. It's kept Lutheran theologians in business for a number of centuries here. And there's a focus there on minutiae, on little teeny theological issues of trying to make sure those are right, because if they are not right, then the church is illegitimate. Another problem with that definition is that church is where there is right preaching and right administration of sacraments, is it's all in a church building. It doesn't put an emphasis on what the lay people are doing out in the world as the church gathered and then the church scattered, the people scattered. So that's a problem. In fact, it's also too clergy-centric. So for example, you could have a priest or a bishop or somebody in one of these deserted European cathedrals, and they, let's say, preach a good sermon and administer the sacraments, but there's nobody there. Or there's a couple of ladies in, pew number 10, and you're going around and you're a tourist and you see, boy, this thing's empty. But that priest feels like he has done what he's supposed to do. Where he has preached the right sermon and administered the sacraments correctly. And so there's got to be a problem, because there's something wrong with that church. Instead, it's, are you witnessing to Jesus Christ in Jerusalem and to the ends of the earth? Or, to use another definition, are you making disciples, more and better disciples, rooted in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, 19 and 20. That's the reason why we typically think of churches having this emphasis of things in the building and what a clergy does. Now, again, that was a reaction to the Roman Catholic Church. It was Martin Luther and Melanchthon trying to get a pure church and to kind of distinguish what they were doing from the Roman Catholic Church. But we don't have to keep that definition of the church. And then one other thing the reason we have this, I would say, distorted, internally focused understanding of the church is looking at what church leadership does. And often what has been done in terms of church governance is that you look at what elders and overseers do in the New Testament. So elders, presbyters, or overseers, or bishops, and you look at all the instances of when those occur in the New Testament, and you try to say that's what church leaders should be doing. And the problem with that is that actually what the bishops and elders were doing in the New Testament they were the caretakers. They were the maintenance people. The movers and shakers in the New Testament were the apostles. And they were the pioneers, and they were externally trying to reach out to new communities, to plant churches, to communicate the gospel to outsiders. And so if you build ecclesiology, a church structure upon what the elders and overseers and deacons do, you end up with a maintenance church that is a caretaker church that is just ministering to those who are already there. And so we need instead to think about church polity by including that function of what the apostles were doing. So we can think, for example, of APEST, apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. That's a better way of thinking about the full range of gifts that we need to have in the church. Again, similar concept here is John Cotter talks about the differences between managers and leaders in organizations, and in the New Testament, the bishops and elders and deacons were really the managers and the leaders who were focused on outsiders and change and those sorts of things with the apostles. And so we need to have churches that take into account that external emphasis that we see in apostles. So what does this look like? Does this mean that we need to all be seeker churches, that our weekend services need to be focused on reaching seekers? No, I don't think so. That is one approach that megachurches, seeker churches have done to really try to light a fire under their congregations, is try to say every weekend service, we're going to try to make our services a place that non-believers would want to come. Saddleback has been part of that. You see that in Andy Stanley's approach, that sort of thing where the weekend services are really attractive. Now, they're also trying to reach Christians and trying to disciple them in that way, but oftentimes they have another mechanism for deeper discipleship, either a midweek service or a strong emphasis on small groups. So that is one way that churches have done this. They've really tried to say, we are really going to be cognizant of the seeker every weekend. Another approach, though, I think, is to have regular worship service, which is designed for believers and focus on formation on the weekends, but to have something like the Alpha Course during the week, which reaches out intentionally to non-Christians, or they're just very intentional on their weekend services to emphasize their people that we are gathered now, but you are to go out into the world and be the church. You are to, the reason we're having this worship service on the weekend is that you might be formed in a light in the world. So I think both of those emphases are important. Both the centripetal, come and see, that, we're gathered, we're, an attractional approach, come and see what we're doing. And also this centrifugal or missional approach where go and tell, we are going out into the world and being a light that way. So both of those are really of emphasis. So all of that to say, my pitch today, again, I would say that the ecumenical consensus is that there's a balance between mission and discipleship. That kind of, there's an internal and external, and those should be in balance. And you're welcome to accept that as the appropriate way to think about it. What I worry about is that when we focus on both of those kind of equally, we need to, have some programs for Christians and them growing, and we also need to have some programs and some efforts that reach out to non-Christians. What I worry about is that this will get neglected, this emphasis on reaching out to outsiders, when actually I think that is of primary importance, and that the discipleship of Christians should really feed into this important purpose of reaching out to outsiders. So I think both are important. Don't hear me wrong. And I'm being a bit provocative to say that this emphasis is on outsiders, but I want you to grapple with that and to wrestle with that and to consider that because I really worry that a problem in our churches is that they become a church which exists for the people already there instead of a church that exists for outsiders.